Stalingrad, 1942. The Volga burned as if the river itself had caught fire. Smoke rose higher than the clouds, turning day into twilight. Somewhere in that black sky, a train screeched to a halt. Among the new arrivals was a young woman in a grease-stained uniform carrying a toolkit heavier than she was. Her name was Lyudmila Zhukova, and she had come to drive a tank. She was 22 and looked like a factory worker from any Soviet poster, broad-shouldered, grey-eyed, quiet. But under the dirt and fatigue lived a kind of fierce certainty. She had no intention of watching men fight while she waited in safety. She had learned to repair engines in a tractor school in Kursk. Now the engines were larger, the stakes infinite. Arrival at the front. The moment she saw her first T-34, her heart tightened. It was not a machine. It was a creature of steel and steam, snarling, alive. She walked around it, running her hand along the scarred armour. Inside, the air smelled of oil, diesel, and sweat. She climbed in without waiting for permission. The crew laughed. "Careful, girl," one said. "This beast bites." She answered without looking up. "Then I'll learn to bite back." The commander grinned and gave her a chance. By the next morning, the girl from Kursk was the new mechanic driver of tank number 432. First fire. Her initiation came within hours. The sky trembled with Stuka sirens. Dust and brick rained down. Lyudmila slammed the hatch shut and felt the engine rumble beneath her boots. Orders crackled through the radio. She shifted gears, the T-34 lurched forward, and the world became noise and flame. She couldn't see much through the slit, only flashes and shadows. Her hands bled from the vibration. She kept driving. When the cannon fired, the shockwave hit her chest like a hammer. Her ears rang, but the engine's heartbeat was steady. When the battle ended, she realized she was still alive. One of the crew handed her a can of water. Her hands shook so badly she spilled half of it. He grinned. "Congratulations, you're a tank driver now." The bond of steel. That night she couldn't sleep. The ground shook with artillery. Some the tank back through enemy fire with half a track missing. After that they gave her a nickname, Ironheart. Stalingrad awakens. By autumn, Stalingrad was hell on earth. Street by street, building by building, every brick was fought over. Tanks moved like metal shadows through the rubble. Sometimes Lyudmila could see enemy soldiers so close she could read the fear in their eyes. She learned to drive through fire, to feel where the ground was mined by the vibration under her palms. The noise never stopped, engines, guns, screams. But her mind became still. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. One night, after a day of constant shelling, the commander looked at her across the flickering light of a kerosene lamp and said, "If we make it through this, you'll go home a hero." She shook her head. "If we make it through this, I just want to go home." The driver's prayer. In December, before another offensive, she wrote a note in her logbook. "If my tank is hit, don't bury me separately. We fought together, we'll rest together." That note would stay in her pocket for the rest of the war. End of the beginning. When her unit rolled out again, the snow was thick, the sky ash-grey, and the enemy waiting. Lyudmila gripped the controls and felt the machine answer. The engine roared back like a living thing. She smiled and murmured, "Let's go, Ironheart." As the tank charged into the blinding smoke, she realized something strange. The fear was gone. Only the mission remained. The battle for Stalingrad had begun, and so had the legend of Lyudmila Zhukova. The morning after their first victory, the Volga was wrapped in fog. Ash fell like snow, settling on the tanks, the bodies, and the river that refused to freeze. Lyudmila Zhukova stood beside her T-34, tightening a damaged track with grease-stained fingers. The engine was still warm from battle. Her hands shook, but not from fear, from the aftershock of surviving. She had learned that victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like silence. Learning to breathe in smoke, Stalingrad had become a machine of war, grinding men and metal alike. Factories turned into fortresses, chimneys fired shells instead of smoke. Every corner was a front line, and every heartbeat sounded like a countdown. For Lyudmila, the tank was the only place that made sense. Inside its steel belly, there was no chaos, no debate, no fear, only orders, engine, and instinct. The outside world was madness. Inside, there was purpose. Her commander, Sergeant Mikhailov, was a man of few words. He had seen too much war to believe in speeches, but he trusted her. When others doubted that a woman could handle the machine, he said quietly, "The tank doesn't care who drives it, only who doesn't stop." She didn't stop. The first loss. Their second battle began at dawn. German armour had broken through the industrial district. Tigers, Panzer IVs, rolling like beasts of iron through the smoke. Lyudmila's unit, 5 T-34s, moved to intercept. They advanced through ruins, the sound of treads echoing like thunder. Dust blinded their sights. The air reeked of burning oil. She shifted gears, feeling the tank strain against debris. Suddenly, the radio screamed, "Left flank hit! Fire in compartment!" She turned, just in time to see one of their tanks engulfed in flame. A hatch flew open. A man crawled halfway out, screaming. Then the ammunition detonated. The explosion threw shockwaves through the ground. Lyudmila froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Then Mikhailov shouted, "Forward! Zhukova, keep us moving!" Her foot slammed on the pedal. She drove straight through the smoke and fire, tears mixing with soot on her face. Later, when it was over, she sat in silence. The wreck still burned behind them. Mikhailov lit a cigarette and said softly, deepened. Snow fell black with ash. Her crew, Mikhailov, gunner Petrov, loader Anton, became her brothers. They ate together, fought together, buried their dead together. During one raid near the Red October factory, they became trapped between two burning buildings. Enemy fire rained down from rooftops. A shell hit the right side of the turret, jamming the rotation. Anton shouted that they were done, but Lyudmila refused. She jammed the clutch, forced the tank forward and rammed through a collapsed wall. The shock almost broke her ribs. The path cleared and the T-34 surged out into the open, cannon blazing. When the smoke cleared, Mikhailov looked at her and muttered, "You drive like the devil himself owes you money." She just smiled, a tired, soot-covered smile, and replied, "He does." Recognition. By early 1943, her unit was one of the few still standing in Stalingrad. Supplies were gone, morale nearly broken, but Lyudmila's tank kept moving. Every time she came back from a mission, more soldiers gathered to see her roll in. A woman covered in soot, eyes like ice, climbing out of a scarred machine that refused to die. Rumours spread. There's a girl driving a tank in Stalingrad. Some said she was lucky, others said she was cursed. The men in her crew knew the truth. She was just relentless. When her division commander finally met her, he shook her hand and said, "You make our tanks look immortal." She replied, "It's not the tank, it's the people inside it." The night before the storm. One night, before the final push toward the Volga, the crew shared their last ration of bread and vodka. They sat in the shadow of the tank, the air freezing, stars hidden by smoke. Mikhailov asked, "If we die tomorrow, what'll they write about us?" Petrov laughed, "That we died heroes." Lyudmila said quietly, "No, they'll write that we kept driving when others stopped." She wasn't being modest, she was being honest. In Stalingrad, heroism was just another word for survival. The baptism. Complete. The next day their tank led the advance through the tractor factory district. The engines screamed, treads tearing through rubble, shells bursting all around. One struck the ground near her, throwing the T-34 sideways. The impact crushed her shoulder, but she stayed at the controls. They broke through the enemy line, a single tank against three. By January 1943, the city was a carcass of stone. Streets had no names anymore. They were trenches made of rubble. Buildings were skeletons, factories tombs. The wind carried ash and the metallic stench of burning metal and blood. Even the snow had stopped being white. And through this inferno rolled a battered T-34 with the words "For Motherland" scrawled in chalk across its armour. Inside sat Lyudmila Zhukova, now the acting commander. The city that ate armies, Stalingrad had swallowed everything: machines, men, nations. The Germans still held parts of the city, but the Soviets fought like ghosts that refused to leave. Every block was a battlefield, every ruin a fortress. The tank crews had a saying: "In Stalingrad, you don't drive forward, you crawl through hell." Lyudmila's crew knew it too well. They had fought for months without rest, sleeping in their tank when the temperature dropped below freezing. The engine's warmth was the only thing that kept them alive. Petrov's hands were blistered from loading shells. Anton coughed blood but refused to leave, and Lyudmila, with a bandaged shoulder and eyes hollow from exhaustion, drove the machine as if possessed. Losing the commander. On the morning of January 10th, the order came. Operation Ring. The Red Army was closing the noose around the last German forces. The battle for Stalingrad's heart had begun. As the tanks advanced through the ruins of the tractor plant, a shell struck nearby, flipping a smaller vehicle. Shrapnel tore through their commander, Mikhailov, before anyone could react. He slumped forward without a sound. Lyudmila grabbed the periscope, scanning the ruins, but there was no time for grief. "Petrov, on the gun! Anton, reload!" she shouted. "I'm taking command." The others hesitated only a second. They obeyed. From that moment, Tank 432 no longer belonged to anyone else. It was hers. The fight in the factory. The Red October factory was a maze of twisted girders and half-collapsed walls. The Germans had turned it into a fortress. Snipers hid in the rafters, anti-tank guns between the pipes. Lyudmila's tank crawled forward through molten snow and rubble, firing at every flash.
The front line was only 50 meters away. She heard German voices shouting in the dark. Somewhere nearby, wounded men called for help. She couldn't go to them. Stepping outside meant death. She sat in the turret and listened until her ears stopped hearing the difference between friend and enemy. The turning tide, weeks later, the encirclement tightened. German soldiers began surrendering in groups, but for Lyudmila's crew, the fighting didn't stop. Their orders were to hold the sector until the final guns went silent. In one of the last battles near the Barakadi factory, her tank was ambushed by artillery from the riverbank. The first hit tore open the side armour. Flames poured in. She screamed for the crew to bail out, but Petrov refused. "Not until you go first, Commander." She hit the hatch and dragged herself into the snow, her uniform burning at the edges. Moments later, the tank exploded, sending a wave of heat that melted the snow around them. She lay in the snow staring at the burning wreck, her tank, her home. Anton and Petrov survived, but barely. They dragged her to cover, her face blistered, her hair singed by flame. The aftermath. When she woke in a field hospital, her ears still rang with the sound of the explosion. Doctors said she was lucky. She didn't feel lucky. Her tank was gone. So was Mikhailov. For days she refused to speak. Then one morning, she asked the nurse for her uniform. "You can't return to battle," the nurse said. "You're wounded." "So is my country," Lyudmila replied, "and it's still fighting." They gave her a crutch, a jacket, and a new assignment, to train fresh crews arriving from the rear. But even as she taught others, her eyes drifted east, to the ruins still burning in the distance. The baptism, complete. When the news came that Stalingrad had been liberated, the city was silent. No cheers, no music, just survivors standing among ruins, too tired to celebrate. Lyudmila walked through what was left of the streets she had fought for, her boots crunched over ice and glass. Where her tank had burned, she found a piece of melted steel, small enough to hold in her hand. She kept it in her pocket for the rest of her life. From that day, she was no longer a driver. She was a commander, forged in the fire of Stalingrad. A woman who had stared into the heart of war and refused to blink. When they brought her back from the ruins, she had no sense of where the sky ended and the smoke began. Her skin smelled of fuel, her hair singed to the scalp. The doctors said she should be dead. Lyudmila Zhukova just asked for a map. They set her leg, bandaged her arm, and told her she would never drive again. She only nodded. Inside, she made another decision. She would return to her tank or die trying. Return from ashes. Weeks later, she left the hospital against orders. The corridors still echoed with the groans of men who would never walk again. She limped outside, wrapped in a greatcoat too large for her, and inhaled the frozen air. The world smelled of rust and victory. At the depot, she found a new machine waiting, another T-34, its armour unscarred, its paint still shining. She ran her hand across the cold metal and whispered, "You'll learn to fight soon enough." The mechanics watched in silence. They had heard the rumours,
the girl from Kursk, the tank that wouldn't die, the commander who crawled out of the flames. When she asked to rejoin the front, the officer hesitated only a moment, then stamped the papers. Commander Zhukova. Her new crew were boys barely out of training. They stared at her bandaged hands, unsure if she was myth or mistake. She told them quietly, "In this tank you're alive only while the engine is." Then she showed them how to make the engine sing. She taught them to feel the terrain through the seat, to count seconds between shells, to listen for the shift in echo that meant danger. Within days, they stopped doubting and started following. Fire. Again, their first mission was to support the infantry pushing west of the Volga. The snow was deep, the wind sharp enough to cut skin. When the first shells came, her crew panicked. Zhukova barked orders, short, calm, absolute. The tank turned, fired, and the recoil threw snow into the air like wings. She felt the old rhythm return. Throttle, gear, breath, trigger. Pain stabbed her shoulder, but she didn't slow. The enemy line cracked. The infantry advanced behind her tracks. When it ended, the youngest loader said, "I thought you were afraid," their helmets, and whispered their names. Then she stood, face streaked with ash, and said to her driver, "Let's move. They're waiting for us ahead." No speeches, no mourning. The only way to honour the dead was to keep the treads turning. Recognition. In May 1943, she was promoted officially to Lieutenant Lyudmila Zhukova, commander of a tank platoon. The ceremony was brief. No band, just a handshake, and a medal still warm from someone else's chest. The general said, "You've done enough, you can rest." She smiled faintly. "Sir, tanks don't rest." The long night. That summer, when she finally had a night without fighting, she sat beside her tank, staring at the stars that had reappeared over the quiet river. She could hear engines in the distance, and for the first time in months she let herself cry. Not for pain, not for fear, but for everything that had burned away inside her. She whispered to the dark, "If the war ends tomorrow, will I still know who I am without the tank?" No one answered. The wind only carried the smell of oil and snow. By dawn she was back inside the turret, hands on the controls. The war wasn't finished, and neither was she. Her wounds still bled beneath the uniform, but the fire in her chest burned stronger than ever. The thaw came slowly. In the spring of 1943, the snow along the Volga melted into black mud, thick enough to swallow boots and trucks alike. But the Red Army no longer cared about mud. It cared about momentum. Stalingrad had been saved. Now it was time to strike back. At the front of the advancing column rolled Lieutenant Lyudmila Zhukova, her tank freshly repainted, her crew older by 100 lifetimes. On the turret, beneath the soot and dust, a small white heart still gleamed, the mark of the Iron Hearts. March west. The campaign westward was a blur of villages and wreckage. Every road was mined, every bridge half destroyed, every forest hiding snipers. But after the fire of Stalingrad, everything else seemed survivable. Zhukova's platoon spearheaded several attacks across the Don region, their T-34s cutting through enemy lines before dawn. Her unit moved fast and hit harder than expected. Commanders began referring to her formation as the hammer that never misses. When her tank's engine roared, soldiers followed the sound. It meant the line was moving. A commander's burden. For the first time, she commanded more than a single machine. She had to think beyond armour and engines, about men. Each new face in her platoon looked to her as if she were indestructible. She wasn't. She just knew how to hide the cracks. At night, she studied maps under candlelight, tracing routes with burned fingers. She rarely slept. When her gunner once asked how she stayed awake, she said, "The noise in my head is louder than the shells." Through fire again. In July 1943, during the Kursk offensive, her platoon was ordered to hold a ridge against advancing German armour. The battle lasted hours, heat, dust, blinding smoke, her radio filled with static and screams. When her gun jammed, she climbed out under fire to clear it herself. A shell exploded nearby, knocking her flat, filling her mouth with soil. She spat blood, dragged herself back inside and shouted, The tank's not done, so neither am I. When the battle ended, the ridge still belonged to the Red Army. Out of 5 tanks, only 2 remained operational. One of them was hers. Moments between battles. After Kursk, they were given 3 days of rest. For soldiers, rest didn't mean peace. It meant time to feel with silence, too afraid to believe liberation was real. In one such village, Lyudmila stepped out of her tank to find a little girl staring up at her. The child reached out and touched the white heart painted on the armor. "Are you real?" she asked. Lyudmila crouched down, smiled faintly, and answered, "I wasn't sure either, until now." The price of glory. By the time her unit reached the Dnieper, Lyudmila had lost count of the battles. Her burns reopened in the cold. Her leg ached so badly she could barely climb into the turret. But she never accepted replacement. When medics offered morphine, she refused. "I need to feel the machine," she said. "It drives better that way." For her actions, she was recommended for the Order of the Red Banner. The medal arrived weeks later in a dented box, accompanied by a note, "For exceptional bravery in battle." She tucked it away without ceremony. The only award she ever cared about was survival, the edge of victory. By the spring of 1944, the war was turning. Rumours spread of the Germans retreating, of the Allies landing in the west. But Lyudmila knew, wars don't end suddenly. They fade out, one village at a time, one grave at a time. Her platoon pushed onward, through forests, fields, cities left in ashes. And through it all, her tank kept moving, its engine coughing, its armour scarred but unbroken, just like her. She wrote in her logbook one last line that winter. "The closer we get to victory, the heavier the heart becomes." The girl from Kursk who once drove into battle with trembling hands was gone. What remained was a commander forged in fire, carrying the ghosts of everyone who didn't make it home. She would see the end of the war, but peace, she knew, would never drive as far or as fast as war once had. When the guns finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than any explosion. Lyudmila Zhukova stood beside her tank on a field outside Warsaw, watching smoke drift like ghosts over the horizon. The war was ending, they said, but she couldn't feel it. The world had grown used to noise. Without it, everything sounded wrong. Homecoming. Her platoon was reassigned to recovery duty, collecting wrecks, escorting refugees, burying the dead. She followed the orders, but part of her stayed inside that turret. At night she dreamed of the engine starting again, of the weight of the throttle in her hands. Then she would wake and the only thing moving was the wind. When she finally returned to Kursk, her mother barely recognized her. The young woman who had left in 1942 had been replaced by someone older, quieter, carved out of steel. The neighbours called her our hero, but she didn't know how to wear the word. Heroes, she thought, don't wake up screaming from the sound of thunder. The forgotten years. In peacetime, there were no tanks to drive, no maps to trace. Factories reopened, medals gathered dust, and stories of men filled the newspapers. Women like her disappeared into the silence between paragraphs. She worked as a mechanic at a tractor plant, irony she learned to laugh at. Every morning she passed a display of a brand new T-34 painted in victory colours. Once she ran her hand across its cold armour and whispered, "You and I did our part. They just don't remember." Her co-workers never knew that the woman tightening bolts beside them had commanded a tank division. Echoes. Years later, veterans began visiting schools telling their stories. When they asked her to speak, she refused. She said she had nothing to say. But one day a boy asked, "Was it scary to drive a tank?" She paused, then quietly, "Every second. That's how I knew I was still alive." It was the first time she had smiled in weeks. Recognition. It took decades before someone found her name in old war records. A journalist came, took her picture beside a tractor and wrote an article titled "The Forgotten Commander of Stalingrad." Overnight, letters began to arrive. Soldiers she had saved, families she didn't know existed. The government sent her a funeral. Neighbours, a nurse, one surviving crewmate. The army sent a wreath and a plaque that read, Lieutenant Lyudmila Zhukova, the Iron Heart of Stalingrad. They buried her next to the local war memorial. On her tombstone, someone carved words she had once written in her logbook. Courage is what survives the fire. And under the winter sun, a faint reflection gleamed off the metal letters, as if somewhere her tank's engine had started once more.